Okay, Amanda, over to you. Let's make a start.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on this Thursday evening. Tonight, we just wanted to give you an overview of the Renters Reform Bill, which was published in June last year. It has been a long time coming. Obviously, we've had a few diversions in the last few years. And we have had a lot of our landlords come to us and ask us our views. So we thought it would be a good idea actually just to do a webinar so people can go back and have a look at it as well. Just to let you know who we are. So we are a lettings agency who specialise in actually shared housing and HMOs in Southwest London, Surrey, Middlesex and South London, although we do have buy-to-lets locally as well in Twickenham, Kingston and Teddington. We started about 5 years ago purely because we had a lot of landlords who came to us, wanted a change of lifestyle, didn't want to do the work anymore and said, you do a great job, can you look after ours? And that's how we were born. So our ethos is we manage your property as if it were our own. So the landlord and the tenants know that they have a person who they can rely on 24/7. So before we kick off tonight, just to let you know, this is just our opinion. There's still lots of information to come out. As ever, all the information is not out there yet. There is a little bit of scaremongering out there, I would say, which is not necessarily fair. So we're hoping to allay any fears that you might have. As I said, just put our point of view across. And overall, the goal really of the rental reform paper was to provide safe and decent homes for tenants. Bearing in mind you guys are on here with us, I'm hoping that you guys are all with us and going, that's not a bad thing at all. And the whole concept of it was to make it easier for tenants to leave an unsafe home and also make it easier for landlords to evict poor tenants for whatever reason. Whether this will be the outcome, we will see. We absolutely don't have all the answers, but we welcome any questions and hopefully we'll have a good, lively discussion. Over to Dan.
Thanks, Amanda. I think it's also important just to say that we're talking about the law in England. The law in Wales and the law in Scotland is different.
Yeah.
As Amanda says, we're focusing on the good guys, we hope. There's an awful lot of content in the white paper, and we've tried to pick out the main areas that we think people should be aware of and should be focusing on. So we're going to talk about the reform of tenancy agreements. We're going to talk about what's happening to repossessions, tenants with pets, tenants on benefits, and rent reviews. So let's start with tenancy agreements, which are going to be reformed. So at the moment, a tenancy agreement has two bits to it. It has an initial fixed period, and then it becomes periodic. The initial fixed period is typically starts with 6 months and might go out to 12 months, 24 months, maybe even longer. And periodic is a fancy property word for something that becomes either monthly or weekly, generally monthly. The proposal from the white paper is that all tenancies will become periodic. They're all going to become probably monthly tenancies. At the moment, a tenant who wants to leave a tenancy before the end of a fixed period is allowed to do so, but they have to pay reasonable costs to leave, and reasonable costs to leave are really rent until a suitable tenant's found and any marketing costs that might be incurred in reletting the room. Currently, after the end of the fixed period, the tenant's got to give, or is able to give, 1 month's notice to leave, but the landlord must give the tenant 2 months' notice. The proposal is that tenants will now also need to give 2 months' notice. I think for families in single let properties who've got some structure to their lives. They've got kids at school, people with regular employment. 2 months notice is absolutely fine. We have a business where we let rooms to young professionals in shared houses. They don't have such a distant horizon. They're some of them struggle with 1 month's notice. I think there'll be an adjustment there for people to realise they've got to give 2 months notice. And I wonder, although there isn't any detail on it yet, whether there will be some kind of get out that actually if the landlord and the tenant agrees to do something and surrender the tenancy agreement, then actually maybe people will be allowed to leave earlier, but that will be at everybody's agreement. That's not necessarily a mandatory thing. There's going to be a 2-stage implementation. So the white paper will become a bill. The bill has to go before Parliament. It has to get royal assent. I would think pretty quickly after it gets royal assent, the government needs to give 6 months notice. And at the end of that 6-month notice period, all new tenancies from that date will become periodic. 12 months later, all existing tenancy agreements will become periodic. So that will include those that are already within a fixed period. License agreements are going to continue. License agreements are a little bit niche, but they typically apply where you've got a lodger in your home, it's hostel type services or holiday accommodation. Holiday accommodation is an easy one to understand. If you go and stay in an Airbnb in Devon for a couple of weeks, the owner of that property knows that you're going to go back to your house and that you haven't got exclusive possession of your property. If you've got exclusive possession, and most people will have, then that's a tenancy agreement. Just considering for a moment some of the potential impacts of the change in tenancy agreements. Scotland have had periodic tenancies since December 2017. I think they're on a month's notice instead of 2 months, and the world hasn't ended. The property industry's kind of carried on pretty much as before. I can see that if you were a family in a single let property, you've got your kids at school, you've got somewhere close to work, and you're having to, you know that you're coming to the end of your fixed period and your landlord might not re-let the property to you. That can be quite a stressful and difficult time. And so taking away fixed periods actually provides more security for people. So I think that's a positive change. And fundamentally, there is still a shortage of rental property in England. We're not building enough houses. We haven't built enough houses for a long time. And there are a lot of landlords leaving the market. So there is an excess of tenants, and there's a shortage of properties. So you would think that on balance, that will be okay.
Got a couple of questions. Oh, go on. Sorry, carry on, Dan.
There's potentially an unexpected consequence for the student market. We have some student lets in Liverpool, and the way the student market works typically is that first years, you go to a new town, you go into halls or you go into a purpose-built block for your first year. In your second year, you've made some friends, so you want to live out somewhere different. You want to live with your friends. You want a more relaxed atmosphere. You want to have a bit of fun without mum and dad being too closely involved. And then in your third year, depending on the university, you'll go back into halls, or you might stay out in the private sector. For those second year students, they sign a fixed term contract beginning on the 1st of July. So this the white paper creates a conflict between what's good for the student and what's good for the landlord. If you're a student, you might say, I don't want to pay rent over the summer, so that's great. But you've then got some uncertainty as to when you come back from your summer vacation or your summer job, and you've got to find somewhere to live before term starts again. If you're a landlord, you might well want, you'll want to be avoiding having voids, and so you'll want to let your rooms from the beginning of the summer if possible. I think how that plays out will depend on individual university towns. I know that we said we're not talking about Scotland, but I know that in Glasgow this year, they told students not to turn up if they didn't have accommodation because they've got a massive shortage of private sector accommodation. Liverpool seems to have more of a surplus of accommodation, so that's going to be something that the market, I suspect, will sort out. There's been some pretty powerful lobbying from people who own purpose-built blocks, and when I say people, these are pension funds, they're not necessarily individuals, and they've managed to get purpose-built blocks excluded from the changes to tenancy agreements by saying that actually you can't use those blocks for anything else, and that these are the kind of blocks where you've got 6 people on half a floor sharing a kitchen and they've all got an individual bedroom. I think that's a bit cheeky personally, and I know in Liverpool, in Leeds, the local private landlords are lobbying hard to have the same exemption applied to private sector student accommodation, because actually the dynamics of the population are broadly the same. One thing I think that is really worth thinking about and will apply, whether it's house shares or whether it's single lets, if everything's periodic, you could have somebody who moves in on day one and gives you notice straight away and tells you you're going in 2 months. There are people who have businesses, or had businesses, I will say, around short-term accommodation where you'd be able to charge a premium rent for offering that service because you did a very short period. That will go straight away because everything is short-term. And finally, I think a 2-month timescale potentially discourages landlords from thinking about some of the more discretionary things that you might consider for a tenant because you particularly like them. They ask for some garden furniture, they want a bike shed. If the mindset is, well, you could be going in 2 months, I think you're much more likely to be thinking, actually, if I spend this money, does this have a benefit for my property over the longer period? Is it going to benefit lots of tenants, or is it just for you? And if it's just for you, I think some of those might stop.
Dan, so I've got a couple of questions here. Is there anything I can do to mitigate this? Because obviously it's not effective. Let's take worst case scenario. In a house, someone moves in on the 1st, exactly to your point, moves in on the 1st, and actually they've only ever wanted it for 2 or 3 months, because there are contractors who want that. How can I mitigate this risk? I think from my perspective, I've got 3 views on that. None of it's ideal. Well, 4 views actually. I think 1, if you are a good landlord, you are doing referencing anyway, I think it's asking the right questions to ensure that somebody is not a contractor, or spotting the contractors and then filtering potentially to those people who have look like they're going to stay more long term. So families rather than a single person, for example. Obviously, it depends on what property you're letting. 2, I have a flat myself that I let, which is furnished. I'm actually going to take out that furniture. So it's going to be unfurnished because it's a lot harder to move. every 2 months or 3 months, or short term if you're shifting all your furniture around. It's a lot easier just to move in with bedding and a few bits and bobs. So I'm actually not going to furnish that. So that might be one thing. Obviously, this potential law applies to ASTs, which is the majority of the residential market. As Dan alluded to earlier, it doesn't cover licenses, it's not holiday lets or company lets or corporate lets. So that is different as well. They are not done on ASTs. So if this concerns you, there are a few things to consider to mitigate or minimize this risk.
No, I think they're good. They're good suggestions. We reference all our tenants pretty thoroughly, but you can only really, you can credit check them. You can check that they've got a job. Everything else that you can find out, I think, is less solid.
I think sometimes,
so actually,
Dan, though. Sorry, Dan, I'll just say, sometimes I think if you're doing the viewings, it's more about just asking the questions and having a chat to them and seeing what they say. Majority of people obviously have permanent jobs, but I think it's just more a bit of a investigation.
Lots of open questions.
Yeah, that's it. That's it.
Let them speak, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we move on to repossessions, so this isn't just getting your house or your room back. This is further down the line when you've fallen out with your tenant for some particular reason. And the law at the moment really there's two buckets of reasons that you can go to court and ask for your property back. There are some mandatory reasons where the judge has to agree with you, should agree with you, and there are some discretionary reasons where you've got to make a good case and hope that you convince the judge to find in your favour. There is one ground that doesn't require a significant level of proof beyond really filling in a form, and that's section 21, a no fault eviction. The tenant doesn't have to be given a reason as to why they've been asked to leave, which they find massively frustrating. But it is if your paperwork is in order, it's quite a straightforward process. The trouble with this is it's been used by landlords who are not some of the good guys. So you imagine the situation where you've got a property that's got a damp problem, and the tenants complain. The landlord doesn't want to spend the money to fix the damp, so they give the tenants a section 21 notice. The tenants leave, they put some new tenants in, the same thing happens. There's still the damp, there's still the complaint, another section 21, and the government doesn't like this, and I subject to a caveat that I'll come to, I completely support that. People shouldn't be moved out just because property's in a poor state, and for no reason at all. So,
or the fact that you might have tenants that we all know, we've all had tenants that don't, the ceiling could be falling in and they don't complain at all. Or we've had tenants complain that there's a little mark on the walls. We've all had tenants like that, but some more scrupulous landlords, as to Dan's point, just cannot deal with complaints. And we all know that's part and parcel of being a landlord.
So this is one of the cornerstones of the whole white paper. It's been on the Conservative manifesto since 2019. They've been trying to get rid of section 21 for much longer. So it's going to be banned, and the landlord has got to give a reason and use one of the existing grounds for repossession. This is going to seem like a strange thing to say, but judges must grant possession when it's been proved that a ground has been met. At the moment, if you go to court for possession, whether it's a discretionary or a mandatory ground, the court can adjourn the possession claim, if you like. And it's happened to us. We had a Section 21 claim for a tenant, and the judge kicked the can down the road for 6 weeks. We'd already got to the point where this particular person was not paying rent. They were stealing food. They were taking drugs in the house. It was a horrible situation, and it was making life pretty unpleasant for the other people in the property. And we were trying to be the good guys, trying to do the best thing that we could, and the judge didn't help us at all. The government has quite rightly said, if a landlord has met the test to repossess a room, you need to give them repossession. You can't step in and put your own slight spin on it a little bit. I'll come to my caveat with this. When the white paper was being consulted, there's lots of discussion in the property industry, and there was talk about, well, if you take Section 21 away, you have to put something back in to replace it. And there's some published documents that go along with the white paper. And one of the ideas was a discretionary ground for antisocial behaviour. Now, I could see that being used in a couple of ways. That might be because you've got somebody in a property who's annoying the neighbours by playing music late at night or having parties or something, and it's not so bad that you get the police involved or there's a criminal prosecution, but it's definitely inconsiderate. Or we, in our shared house business, we get people who one person will choose to bully some of the others, and it makes the whole environment in the property very difficult. Being able to gather a bit of evidence and go to court and say, look, this is happening, please can you ask them to leave, would be great. If you read the white paper, that particular discretionary ground has been taken out, and it says something slightly limp to do with landlords and tenants should just try and resolve their differences. Well, that's not always quite how it works in the real world. And I really hope that the government puts more detail into this and explains what they're going to replace Section 21 with things, with tools, with legislation that landlords and agents can actually use. My fear is that they won't do that. They'll go for the headline grabbing Section 21, and we'll be left trying to muddle along with what's left.
Yes, I think out of everything in the white paper that is a little bit more concerning for me, this is one of the ones, I think. I don't know, maybe I've been in it too long, Dan, and I'm just a bit cynical. We've just got to, hope that, to your point, they bring proper grounds in to get rid of people.
We would always try and certainly advise anybody, we always try and negotiate. Often it's cheaper to waive some rent or give a tenant some money to move them on than it is to go to court and have a fight. That's always the last resort. But you do need somebody in your corner when actually you do have to do that. You will meet somebody eventually who's going to be difficult, and landlords need some support in this area.
Yeah, so as we alluded to, we manage an awful lot of HMOs in, South London, really. And what Max has just raised a point about our HMOs in jeopardy going forward if we don't have support from the government to get rid of tenants. I think although we've highlighted a few, Max, we've had a couple of antisocial, and it does go with the territory. The majority of our hundreds of tenants are lovely, lovely tenants. So it's always, but as with all of these things, it's 2% of the tenants who provide 95% of the work for us. The answer is no, I don't think they are in jeopardy from my perspective. We do have to have a lot of negotiation, a lot of talking. And the best way forward is always to arrive at a peaceful solution rather than going to court. But I think the government have realised, in my view, that we haven't, as landlords, it's been very difficult to evict antisocial tenants because of all the evidence required. So we just have to wait and see what mandatory grounds they bring out with evidence within, the Section 8, I think.
Yeah, I think there's lots of millions of landlords who've got a vested interest in this, and there's some good lobbying from people like the NRLA who will. I can't see that they can't. Something has to go in the hole. I think.
Yeah, there'll be too. Yeah, otherwise it will just become too difficult. So I am. This is out of everything, this is my bigger concern, but we will deal with the cards when they are dealt. Also, just with repossessions, Saprava had said, if I need to sell to get some money, what to do? Dan, I don't know if you want to answer this question about new ground coming in. New
ground coming in. I think there's two, actually. One, if you want to sell, and one, if you want to move back into the property yourself. And I think those are proposed to be 6 months notice.
Yeah, or you can't do it within the 6 months. Yes, I think so. Or you can't do it within the first 6 months of a new tenancy. But I think they are mandatory grounds because obviously people will need to sell their properties. So that will become a mandatory ground. Max was talking about referencing as well, becoming extremely tough. I'm presuming, Max, you're talking more about the periodic tenancies. I just think for me, there might be a little bit more of Facebooking. I don't know if anyone's Facebooks and tries to find a little bit more about their tenants. And also, I think if you're in this business long enough, you do have a bit of gut feel as well, which I think is really important. And we always tell our property managers, if you are remotely unsure, do not take them. If it was your house, you were unsure, do not take them. So yeah,
I think also, as I said, we reference pretty thoroughly.
Yeah,
I would always take a previous landlord's reference.
Well, we take two, don't we? We take two.
Yeah, but sometimes with a pinch of salt, I would suggest there might be people who've got a problem tenant. And might not mention that on a reference. Will that change? I'm not sure, but I think if you start to build a history that you're, to Amanda's point, if you're a contractor and you're one of the in for 2 months, out in and somewhere else for 2 months, that's going to show up pretty quickly in your referencing. And so actually, I think maybe the questions is, well, how long did you stay in the last property and the one before? Those kinds of questions will become more important, as well as we've said, just looking them in the eye and asking them whether they're telling the truth or not, without actually asking them that.
And Max, to your question about HMOs again, a lot of prospects say they can't give a previous landlord. We will always insist on a previous landlord, or they have to have a guarantor. I know that doesn't help with antisocial behaviour, but current landlords, dare I say it, might want to get rid of problem tenants and not always be truthful. We've definitely experienced people doing that to us in the past, which is why it's, in our view, imperative to get a previous landlord. So that's why we always insist on it. But I get also with HMOs, people have just come from university, just from being a student and that kind of thing, which is why I think going forward, it may be important to get a guarantor's perspective as well. Although that, as I said, it doesn't help with their antisocial element of it.
You can include, you can have a guarantor agreement, and you can make the guarantor responsible for what the tenant is doing, and that maybe that is a way to, somebody might be being difficult, but at the point that their uncle or whoever the family friend that's helping them out gets a phone call to say so and so's stealing food and bullying the girls or something, that might be there's nothing like a bit of external pressure on somebody to make them think about their behaviour.
Get their stuff together. And so, Prava, in answer to your question, I'm afraid that is correct. Tenants, should they wish, can put notice in on day one, but the landlords can't. Correct. Afraid so.
Okay. Shall we move on to arrears?
Yep.
Okay, so
always a happy topic, rent arrears. Hopefully most people don't suffer this too much.
So currently, if your tenant's 2 months in arrears at the time you give them notice, and at the time that you the application's heard in court, you can have repossession. That's a Section 8 claim. That's not going to change. Wily tenants who've possibly been advised by citizens' advice or shelter will be told that if you receive a Section 8 notice, pay some of your rent and get yourself below the 2-month arrears limit, because actually when that claim comes to court, the claim is thrown out and the poor landlord, despite having paid to be in court, is back to square one again. And the whole process, it's a bit like my description of the poor repairs. You end up with people who are serial non-payers, who will always push it to the limit, take you over the line, and then pay a bit of rent and carry on again. Thankfully, the government has recognised that this isn't very fair, not fair on the landlord, and so there's going to be a new mandatory eviction where if you've got 2 months of arrears, at least 3 times in the last 3 years, regardless of what your rent balance is when it goes to court, then possession will be granted, which I think is that's a really positive step. We've met a number of people who would benefit from this. Currently, you've got to give somebody 2 weeks notice for a Section 8 claim. That's going to become 4 weeks. Any questions there, Matt, Amanda? Or
no, just going back a little bit of a step though. Does the guarantor also responsible for the tenant's behaviour have any legal weight? I doubt it. It's more family pressure, I would have thought, or whoever their guarantor is. From a legality perspective, I don't think they've got any say on that. Would be my personal view. I'm not 100% sure, but no, I doubt it.
Depends. I think it depends what they've done, and there's an interesting difference between the type of agreement you use for a guarantor. So if you have a deed, that's got to be witnessed, and they're quite a bother to do properly. You can get a guarantor agreement that you can sign electronically, so it doesn't need to be witnessed and can be done quite painlessly, and they stand up in court. That's a really good way of making people responsible for things. And nobody's going to, mostly people aren't going to want a phone call from a letting agent or a landlord saying, you know, your son, or whoever it is, your best friend's daughter is misbehaving. There might be one or two, but it's pretty isolated.
Another question, how many months advance rent I may ask for legally? So at the moment, you can ask for any months in advance legally. I don't believe there's a cap on it. Obviously, I think mainly you should be asking for months in advance, rent in advance. I would say generally from overseas tenants who don't have any credit history or they're moving back to the UK. If it's because they wouldn't pass your normal affordability or referencing criteria, I would question why we would take them on if you had a choice of tenants. Going forward, technically, I think you could only ask for a month in advance because they can give 2 months notice. So I don't really think this will come out hopefully, but I don't think you'll be able to ask for much months in advance. But what I do know is that if you do and they leave, so if you got 6 months rent in advance and they left at 3, you will have to pay that back.
Yeah, absolutely. You can ask for it, but don't spend it because
no, because it's not yours. You'll have to give it back.
You'll have to give it back. There's going to be some protection for tenants whose arrears are caused by the late payment of universal credit. We've seen more people of late relying on universal credit. They've lost their job and trying to get themselves back on their feet. We try and be as sympathetic as we can, but it can be slow. It can be really slow sometimes.
One more question. Can we ensure notice from the tenants should not allow them to adjust with deposit money? I think what you're trying to ask is, can tenants pay their last month's or their last month's rent with deposit? Certainly in our ASTs, they're not allowed to do that because the whole point of a deposit is it's kept right into the end for any damages or anything like that. A lot of tenants always ask, can I just use the deposit to pay my last month's rent? The answer to that is always categorically, no, you cannot. And I would never recommend that because that defeats the whole purpose of the deposit.
Mostly people are good and they stick with that. Sometimes people don't, and you can't, there's generally not enough money in it to make it worth having a fight with them about it. You're better off taking the deposit and just keeping an eye on them over the last month or so.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Making sure that the room's left in a decent or the property's left in a decent condition.
So obviously we're trying to cover many things here, not all, and we can't cover everything from the white paper, and there are other things such as a database that all private landlords who don't use an agency will all have to join, as well as agencies. But we're all here to help each other. All the good landlords help each other out. So if you want any further advice or any help or anything, just please don't hesitate. Get your camera out, take a picture of the barcode, and then just drop as a note, book a slot in our calendar. I'm more than happy to help you out with any further questions you may have, whether it's to do with the white paper or anything else. Over to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you. So, tenants with pets.
Furry friends, everybody loves them, or do they?
Currently, you might see a property being advertised as no pets allowed. Your tenant can ask if they can have a pet, and there's absolutely no requirement for you to consider that request at all. Tenants are going to be given the right to request a pet at a property, which the landlord must consider and not unreasonably withhold consent. The government has suggested that landlords request pet insurance to be taken out. This seems a bit one of those things that was a good idea, but it's not really been thought through. Pet policies will often only cover the health of the animal, not damage. You need a pretty comprehensive photo inventory to prove to an insurer that anything that happened in the property had been done by a pet and not by a person. And the really obvious things actually is that somebody might just say they've got some pet insurance and have it for a bit and then stop paying it. And then you've got to go to court with a discretionary ground in front of a judge and say, please will you evict these people because they haven't paid their pet insurance. I personally don't think that's going to be a thing.
And also, even if they do have pet insurance, it's about carrying it on every year. You've got to ask them again and that. So everybody has to, keep going back to check.
and there are some reasonable reasons for saying no, or so withholding consent, because actually it's a shared house and everybody else in the house is allergic to dogs, or they're scared of dogs. Or
could you imagine, Dan, having a shared house with 6 people and 6 dogs? Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. No,
not, can't even contemplate that. Or actually, you might be in a block of flats and the freeholder has said no dogs, because actually it's a quiet environment and people, you've got some particular sorts of people there who don't like noise. They like a quiet life. So I think feels like one of those slightly box ticking things a little bit.
I think personally, I think box ticking is a good word to use. I mean, what they haven't, whether more guidance will come out on, an Alsatian in a 2nd floor flat, in a 1-bed studio, I don't know. Number of animals, nobody really wants a zoo in their house. I've got no idea. I think hopefully there'll be some more information that comes out on that. But yeah, absolutely not in an HMO.
The devil with all of this is in the detail, isn't it?
Yeah, of which there's not a lot at the moment.
Tenants on benefits. So this is taken from the white paper. 2021, 44% of landlords were unwilling to let to tenants on housing support or universal credit. So the headline is, it's going to become illegal for landlords or agents to have blanket bans on renting to families with children or those in receipt of benefits. And you hopefully don't see them, but there have definitely been adverts that have said, no DSS, no benefits, or working professionals only. Is some work, and again, this is another devil in the detail. There needs to be some work with insurance providers, and I think particularly mortgage lenders. Mortgage lenders will be, particularly at the moment, concerned about getting as much rent in as possible so that the landlord can continue paying the mortgage. Anything that reduces that rent will make them nervous, and that will be written into the insurance contract somewhere in the very, very small print. And so whilst the government might wish you to let to people on benefits, and that's a worthy thing to do, actually you might not be allowed to. You might be in breach of your mortgage contract, and that's something that you definitely should be staying away from. The government wants to explore how tenants with money difficulties on benefits can have their rent paid directly to the landlords. We've had tenants who, through no fault of their own, end up in money difficulties, sometimes because they're not very good with money, and we've asked Universal Credit to pay the money directly to us, and they won't. We have to wait until we've served them a Section 8. They've got to be at least in 2 months in arrears. So if they can make it work, maybe that's a positive thing. I think that there's also some wording in the white paper that I think is a bit of a fudge. So the headline is, you can't have these blanket bans, but the white paper says we'll support landlords to make informed decisions on individual circumstances rather than relying on blanket bans. To me, I read that as saying, well, actually, I can talk about affordability criteria. So actually, I can't move somebody who's, whatever it is, £400 roughly in London for housing benefit. I can't move somebody like that into a property where the rent's a couple of £1,000s a month. That's just not a thing. So I don't.
I think common sense, it's discrimination, it's equality, but as a landlord, you filter through your inquiries and you pick the best person or the most suitable person for your property. But it's your choice.
Certainly, we have a lettings business. When we're acting as agents, we are acting for our landlord customers,
Yeah,
and with
absolutely.
their best interests at heart as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So rent reviews, currently you can have an upward or downward, but most likely upward rent review, providing the tenant agrees or they sign a new rental agreement. There's no cap on that, except that if you try and go above market rent, tenants do have the ability to take you to a tribunal, and if it can be shown that you've been unreasonable, you are likely to be penalised for that. So rent increases are only going to be allowed once a year. I think that's probably best practice at the moment anyway. Rent review clauses have become common in fixed tenancies that are over a year, and they are often vague by their nature. So review clauses are going to be banned, and actually any rent increase has got to be justifiable and in line with market prices, and that to me seems entirely fair and reasonable, and that's broadly what we would do at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, at the moment we do rent reviews, only ever on an annual basis or longer than that if it's on single lets after the current fixed terms. Yeah, and always in line with the market. Sometimes if they're lovely tenants and great tenants, below the market value in consultation with the landlord, if that's the way that they would like to move. Also, currently we only have to have you only have to give 1 month's notice for any price increases. We actually do more than that anyway, and then I think it will become 2 months' notice going forward, which we currently do anyway, just to give tenants a bit more time to think about it, have a discussion, or accept or move on. So again, I don't think there's many implications here, because I think if you're doing best practice anyway, it's not going to be that different, in my view.
Yeah, and encouragingly, the government said that it doesn't support rent control, as this leads to a lack of investment in the sector. I know in other European countries where a rent cap has been highlighted as a thing that will happen in the future, and rents get capped by inflation or some other measure, landlords race to get the rents to the maximum value as they can, as quickly as they can, and actually that penalises the very people that the rent control is supposed to protect. So the tenants. So that's a positive step.
As with all these things, Dan, the government tried to do one thing, and there's all these unintended consequences which are never really thought through.
Yeah, I know. We think that the white paper is likely to become a bill in 2023, and it might become a bill by the end of June. It is a flagship Conservative policy. They want to get it through and potentially not get distracted before we have another election, which would be January 2025 at the latest. Assuming that the bill was passed on the 30th of June and notice was given immediately, all new tenancy agreements from January 2024, 1st of January 2024, would be under the new rules, so they would be periodic. And then on January 2025, 1st of January 2025, all existing tenancy agreements would become periodic, regardless of whether they were previously fixed. For the student, assuming that's all happens, for the student market, so the first tenancy agreements that would be under the new rules would be the 25-26 academic year.
So for example, in this case, not the student case, but just normal single lets, we have got landlords who are asking for long-term fixed because that suits the tenant, prospective tenant, and it suits them. You know, and in some cases it's been 2 years, kind of fine. In one case, I was speaking to a landlord today, and she was asking, well, can we go for 3 years fixed? Because we want, you know, tenants want security of tenure. I'm like, you can, but it's all going to be a little bit irrelevant because the new legislation is more than likely to be in before the end of the tenancy, so we'll make it all null and void. So, I mean, it's not for tomorrow, but it is for further down the line when you're thinking about new tenancies and fixing them for longer term. It's likely, depending on when it is, just, yeah, as Dan said, it's likely to be from January 2025. It'll be irrelevant anyway. So we'll see.
Hopefully the later the better, but I think that's going to be a thing. Do we have,
yeah.
Are there any more questions that we
can... No, I think that was mainly it. I think, can you just put the other QR code up again, please, Dan? So a couple of people asked for the QR code again. So yeah, please feel free just to take a picture of it and just drop a schedule into our Calendly. I hope that's not too negative. It doesn't mean to be negative at all. It is what it is. There's always going to be change. We've had loads of change for the last 20 odd, 30 odd years. There's going to be more change going forward. I think this is one of the bigger changes. But I think if you are a good landlord, you have good tenants, then the relationship should continue. I don't think it's anything to worry about. There's always going to be a few challenges. And I had a few bits in here about HMOs and antisocial behaviour. That's always challenging now. I think that depends on what comes in for the mandatory changes, the mandatory clauses, if you like, for evicting tenants. We'll just have to wait and see on that from the government. But definitely big changes afoot. But again, nothing to be fearful of, I don't think. I think everybody on here is all for a positive private rented sector. We all want our tenants to be happy in our houses. We all want them to enjoy it. We don't want them to live under stress. And we all realise that everybody has a role to play in that. Yeah, so anything else from you, Dan?
I don't think so. Just want to say thank you for giving up a part of your Thursday evening. You know, your time is valuable. We hope that you've learned something useful.
Yeah,
it's been great to spend some time with you. If there's anything we can help you with,
I think some of you should have had a mobile text. So my mobile number. I've probably sent you a text over the last couple of weeks, just reaching out. So if you decided a later time without the Calendly code, just to drop me a text, then please do. Anything we can help, we'll be delighted to help you.
Enjoy the rest of your evening, whatever you're doing.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Again. Take care.
Bye.